Doodle doo 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 doo. Secrets of Sea of Secrets. Greetings, I'm Demonac, and this is a little behind the scenes on Sea of Secrets Episode 4, The Sea Wing. An episode which was also supposed to cover the events of what is now Episode 5 as well, but the script was over an hour long, so I had to split it, because I had already crunched number 5 as much as possible, and I didn't want to cut all number 4's character development. I went through a lot of revisions trying to write Pelor's backstory cold open. I pretty quickly gave up on the flashback like Jinx and Blues, but should I narrate it? Should he narrate it? And how factual versus larger than life should it be? I think this answer, Pelor narrating it in character by way of introducing himself to Sauna, felt the best for sure. It's always interesting combining the player's backstory from a series of emails with my ideas for fleshing it out and integrating it into, first, the world of Deathvin, and second, the story I hope to tell within the campaign. And then now, looking back at what happened at the table and trying to further refine and adapt it into Sea of Secrets, with the objective of telling the best version of the plot and of each character's story. For example, in my pre-campaign ideas and back and forths with Pelor's player, I made up a bunch of other notable members of the Yellow Cloaks, most of whom are clearly present in the silhouettes of the animation. But I also had a plot about who took over the mercenary group after Old Man Gungnir fell in battle. Except the campaign plan, and execution, was that we were leaving behind Larrick and Tark quite quickly, which made that stuff kind of irrelevant. So, while my rest of the gang character designs are part of Pelor's story, the actual tales he tells in the intro are the main two stories the player came up with, demonstrating exactly what kind of role the Yellow Cloaks played in the politics of Larrick. When you rewatch him telling a story, I particularly like how part of the reason the people of the southern province paid off the Yellow Cloaks was because of the evil governor's habit of hiring violent thugs. So, I didn't have a recording for the back half of episode 3, and that was the same session as a big chunk of number 4 as well. In original TDDC, I probably would have spent a paragraph on Pelor's party in the Firehawk attack, mentioned the storm, and then skipped ahead to the shipwreck. And there's definitely an argument for doing that. Get right to the action. You can tell I was largely planning on doing this, by the post-credits scene on number 3 turning the Firehawks fight into a joke. Again, could have just gone over it quickly in passing in this episode. But the thing is, there are countless ways to adapt a story. For pacing, we've had a lot of traveling and fooling around already, so I would love to skip to the action. But looking at it from the perspective of character arcs, of learning about their backgrounds, and about the PCs as people, there were a bunch of scenes that happened in this time period that could help us understand them better, in ways that might provide a different lens for some decisions they make in the future, even in the more actiony parts. And then, fortunately, when I got into the recordings of the following session, the storm and the shipwreck, we happened to start by discussing what happened in the last session, including a pretty good amount of detail on the Firehawk Manticore battle. Not the die rolls, of course, but 95% of the time die rolls aren't that important in telling the story of a D&D battle. It's really about what went well, what went poorly, what cool or horrible things happened, and how people felt throughout. And of course, when we recapped it the next week, that's what everyone brought up. So I knew that Jinx used her bard song, which, sure, it's what she always does, but it was actually cool because standing near the middle of the ship, she could boost not just a party, but the entire crew. +2 to hit and damage is huge for a dozen level 1 or 2 NPCs. And, as Jinx's player said, Wolverine and Disco Fever did all the heavy lifting. I knew Pelor had taken over one of the deck guns and was effective. I remembered Misho shaking his fist in a futile gesture as the melee guy against all aerial threats, but then he tried to help put out the fires, and I remember him having to decide to pounce on the fleeing, probably druid bird, or on the manticore that was the current threat. Blue remembered that he spent a whole 2 power points and took no damage, but he was effective because he frightened off a good number of the birds, while Adria and Jinx spent all their healing belt charges helping keep people in the fight. And then I had my GM notes about which crew were hurt and who had died. The rest is all storytelling and pacing. That stuff I've been doing for 10 years in TDDC, which, at the beginning, was working off nothing but my memories jogged by pretty sparse text session notes, which weren't much better than this list of battle details I made from my recording of the recap. Pause if you want to read what I just summarized. So, when I created Captain Sana for the game, I wanted her to be cool. The cool captain. But, as sometimes happens with D&D players meeting non-player characters, who usually exist only in Theater of the Mind, some of them decided they liked her a lot, almost instantly, with very little justification, and, given that, felt it was my job to have her live up to their high opinion, if at all possible. So, I did my best, and she ended up having enough personality that when she and the party disagreed on something, it felt like they were debating with a friend rather than arguing with a jerk who was getting in their way. And it's super easy in a role-playing game for NPC obstacles to be seen as nothing more than that, even when they have been on the party side most of the time. So they did like her in the game. I got past that part, and in many ways it's easier, though not automatic, in an adaptation where I am writing all sides of the dialogue. But animation presented new barriers in that I had to draw an attractive woman who shows emotions, who feels in command, and also I had to voice her, which, like most characters who are in the show for a long time or have a lot of dialogue, I would prefer to do myself, rather than commit Orestria and I to many long intercontinental recording sessions. It wasn't just coming up with a consistent voice that reads as feminine, already a challenge for me, but it meant doing another one when I already had two female PCs who have to sound different, and where I'm trying to avoid bad falsettos, or that super breathy, fake female voice. I mean, I did my best with the art. I'm not good at hair, and doing hair in a semi-lineless style is pretty different than the way you would do it with pencil or stylus, so most normal tips don't work for me. But I usually get there, through just a lot of experimentation, trying to copy Tangled, the animated series. When I got her hat looking good, that gave me a bit of an anchor, and I just worked from there until I got something that looked pretty enough. Then I had to work backwards to fill in under the hat. In scenes where she's hatless, I find it funny that she effectively has hat hair. Like, yeah, I guess that works. Hopefully her voice was okay. Giving her a bit of a frost giant accent helps to differentiate her from Adria and Jinx, though, as with most accents, it adds an extra layer of work to try to keep it under control, try to prevent it from becoming a caricature. Every female voice that I do myself, rather than getting Orestria, I'm always worried about the dude doing a woman voice becoming distracting. You get into so much weirdness with the age ranges of various fantasy species living side by side. It's not just that Captain Sana, in her mid to late 30s, has ended up commanding people a few decades her elders. Like Brother Anvil, the ship's chaplain, is in his early 110s. That's solidly adult. But despite his bald spot, he's not yet middle-aged by dwarf standards. Many dwarves live to be 300. That's similar to 80 or 90 years for modern humans, meaning that some uncommonly persistent dwarves live much longer, a very few getting close to 4 centuries. But though that gives their species a very different relative perspective on age, a mere 100-year-old dwarf can still have quite a lot of experience, whether in crafting or engineering or, in Anvil's case, in people skills and emotional intelligence. Now, this doesn't mean dwarves have tons of level 20 warriors because they've been fighting for 100 years, because maximum lifespan has very little correlation to the length of time you survive on the battlefield. A human is just as likely to survive 3 battles as a dwarf with the same level of training. And most people who survive 3 or more battles, let alone a whole war, are likely to be injured along the way or otherwise get out of the fighting business. Now, even at over a century old, as he mentioned, Anvil was born during the Illud era. Their civil war has been ongoing for 300 years. And that means Adria, who is about 200 years old, has also never seen a united Diluvian empire, though Shoitul may have. She's over 300. Which is nothing, because Jinx's first instinct was right. Longlegs does, in fact, have the experience to be captain of an elven ship, because he has been a ship captain for close to 200 years of his life. Now, at around age 600, he has lived out his own captainy ambitions, to the point that he had to reflect on what he really wanted going forward. Clearly, that still meant life at sea, but he decided he'd rather have just a little less responsibility for a while, or rather, a different sort of responsibility. Sharing his knowledge and mentoring others who had not had the chance to be captain for a century. And it turned out that helping a young human run her first ship felt pretty rewarding to him, so he's stuck with her for 10 years so far. It takes a certain level of humility and being secure in your own skin for a 600-year-old to take orders from a person who is under 40. Now, being clinically immortal, you can't really make those like an 80-year-old human, or similar comparisons with elves or Ytarrans, but statistically, most elves don't make it to 600. Accidents, illness, monsters, and war, whether or not you take a lot of risks, the cumulative chances of something happening just keep adding up over the centuries. But of course, even Longlegs wasn't around to witness the events of that story with the cleansers. That was well before his time. And yet King Dietrich and Queen Floretta were the monarchs before that tale, and are still ruling Talaris to this day. They've been around since the beginning of the so-called Age of Mortals, as long as the oldest dragons, or anything else that isn't a god or a spirit, really. And even the avatar of the goddess of nature did not take them lightly. That story is covered in more detail towards the end of a very old video I made called Basics, the Elves. Vector art is a pretty good medium for drawing technical or complex stuff. Not only do you have layers and tools for effortlessly drawing straight lines and circles, but you can create and nest symbols, which individually have their own layers and can be reused, duplicated, and if you change a part, by default that change would filter through to every other place that symbol is used. And you can create moving parts, animated bits which loop and copy or move those around. So many tools. On the other hand, objects are nowhere near as physical as 3D art. And while there are some pseudo 3D tools and ways to build skeletons, armatures in Adobe Animate, I haven't really learned all that stuff, so I can draw fairly technical objects, and I can animate the dog running around the deck while the ship bobs up and down subtly as the wake flows out from it. But it still takes a bunch of work, especially when my core design for the show involves that isometric sort of view, which is inherently distorting because, at least the way I'm doing it, some objects are constant size and angle from the front to back, instead of getting smaller as they get farther away, as you'd expect from proper perspective drawing. All of which is a lead up to the ship. I drew a ship, and while I didn't quite go nuts on the research, I did put in a certain amount of work and reference into adding details to give the impression of realism. Despite the fact that the Sea Wing is an elven hull, so it ought to look a little different than real-world ships, a little sleeker, the dwarven ships in my world tend to look very much like real ships, usually square-rigged, big chonkers. So I went with triangular sails for the elven ships, but beyond that, they use angled masts. Does it make sense? Probably not, but fantasy. I've looked at sail diagrams, pick and choose and simplify and adapt, but trying to get the feel that they might be real. When they go into the storm, I looked up how to configure sails for a storm. You can't have your big full sails because too much wind could tear them loose or even snap the wooden parts. But you can't just tie down all your sails completely, because no sails means no control. Like riding a bicycle, you need to keep up some speed in order to avoid going sideways. So you end up with a couple smaller sails, a storm jib, etc., which are tightly anchored in two places with a third movable anchor point that you use to control it, both the direction and the slack, all trying to get enough wind at an angle that helps keep you moving, but without getting your sails torn up and becoming dead in the water, completely at the whim of the waves. So it's not about going crazy on realism, fully modeling a ship. that would be a waste of art time, even for an episode like this where the ship is in basically every scene. But it's creating enough details relative to the rest of the art that your brain kind of accepts the whole thing as real. For example, there are a bunch of lines anchoring the mast, and some of them are climbable, and they have those big wooden blocks near the bottom used to adjust the slack on the lines. Are there enough lines in the right places? Hell no. And my blocks are enormous, way too big, but it gives the right impression. And those wooden grates, which let in light and airflow to the lower decks, are a great detail from real sailing ships. So maybe you don't worry about the fact that I didn't clutter the deck with wooden crane structures they ought to have to help move cargo and supplies from the docks. One feature that did not make it into the art was that the deck of the Sea Wing is supposed to be lined with subtle grooves designed to divert water from rain or breaking waves away from the hatches on the deck and back overboard via little drainage gaps in the side railing. The suggestion is that the elven shipwrights carved or planed the planks of the deck with great precision, and I spent enough time on this thing without trying to draw that. I did the storm as best I could, but I was having a hard time making the sea look properly wavy, and doing the crests of water hitting the hull, it just wasn't practical at that moment to try and show big waves crashing over the deck, which they certainly were in the rough parts of the storm. Anvil was flippantly exaggerating the risk of being washed off, especially for a trained sailor, but it is a real risk. Meanwhile, Pelor, being a silly player character, went out during the storm to sit in the middle of the deck and use his glaive like an oar, miming as though he were paddling a kayak, which was mildly funny, but not worth the art time, in my opinion. Also, it makes him look like a jack-off to all the sailors who are working hard. Side note, I'm annoyed by the fact that if you are close in on a big symbol, like the ship, leaving big chunks of it out of frame, Adobe Animate's exporting procedure seems to waste a ton of memory on all that stuff that is not in the frame. I had to make special versions of the ship that chopped off everything but the part in focus to stop it from crashing. And I shouldn't have to do that. The exporting process should do that virtually, automatically, before trying to handle 50,000 by 50,000 pixels for a 2560 by 1440 video. Maybe work on that, Adobe, instead of adding shitty AI features to Photoshop. Okay, thanks, bye. Everybody liked Tiggy, another just a little guy, so I guess it's no surprise that Blue got along with her and decided to keep her company during the storm. In the planning phase for this episode, I was strongly considering changing Tiggy to be a goblin, a regular green one. It wouldn't have changed her personality or voice at all, and I thought it might add another dimension, an interesting in, to discuss Blue's feelings about goblins, a race he doesn't really know, but everyone tells him it's what he is, which of course ties into the more fundamental problem of him not having a background, no memories of any life before he woke up in that crystal tube. There were some benefits to the goblin-to-goblin version of the conversation, and I might have done that if Tiggy had been a dwarf or a human or whatever to begin with, but she's already one of very few gnomes in the series, and a goblin sailing the southern seas actually takes more explanation. It raised more questions than it was worth. So I came up with a way to take the conversation in a similar direction without changing Tiggy's species. And after all, are rats not spread and multiplied by humanoids as much as those other so-called domesticated animals? Why then should rats be so cruelly denied those same opportunities for culinary experimentation? Tiggy and Shuito,
水图
the navigator with the hard-to-pronounce Chinese name, both have unusual hair colors, because both gnomes and Eladrin originate from the Feywild, that stranger alternate plane where nobody gets to complain about my terrible colorblind palette decisions. Tiggy's a lot friendlier, though, even though I certainly have a soft spot for a bookish, bespectacled introvert who heard there was a party going on and thought, "Bah, I have work I could be doing," even though she has undoubtedly navigated this sailing corridor countless times before. Similar to designing the ship, I put in the minimal base amount of effort to give her an appropriate navigational tool and ruler, and to make a half-decent current map. But then, I needed to fill more of her desk. It looked too empty. So I flipped and mutilated that map to look different, and for various production reasons, which I regret in hindsight, she ended up with the good map in front of her where she is working, but that made the shitty map more prominent on her scenes. On the somber day after the Firehawk battle, there was some question of the appropriate burial rites for the dead sailors. There are common practices, but it depends on the individual's own beliefs and customs. The players, of course, take this in with varying degrees of seriousness, much of which we take to be out of character, but it often gets fuzzy. What are we going to do about Ja? She didn't want to be buried at sea. Shit happens. Captain Sana is like, I'm responsible for a lot more than one dead person, even if she was a friend. She gave her life in defense of the sheep and the rest of us. We'd be ignoring that sacrifice just to land right on top of whoever attacked us. We could be digging our own graves. We can't just toss her into the fish. It'd be violating her beliefs. She probably didn't believe in getting harpooned to the deck either, but that's what happened to her. What were her beliefs? She followed Lareth's old farmer traditions, that it's important to be returned to the soil. Lareth's also the god of weather, right? Wouldn't the same god's sailor traditions be close enough? I don't think religious sects are fungible like that. Fine for others, sure, but not for poor Ja. Oh, because I was going to offer to make a floating pyre for her. Viking style? Well, several more people might be dead if it wasn't for Ja. So I would like to find some kind of compromise. Can we preserve the body somehow until we find a safe landing? Well, let's see. You're right in the middle of the strait now, about as far from land as at any point in your trip. Continuing east as planned, you'll be off Dialia's Cape in about 2 days, and from there, you'd be hugging the coast the rest of the way. The plan wasn't to go any closer to shore than anchor depth, though. Put her in a barrel? She won't decompose in 1 day. No, but since the suspicion is that druids are to blame, Sana's concerned that landing may expose the crew to more danger. Does Blue have a sense of smell? Yeah, but it's probably optional since I don't breathe. Could just keep the body in your quarters till we get there. That is not okay. I'm not immune to disease. But you wouldn't have to smell it. How much salt do we have? We could mummify her, dry her up. If you want to fight Tiggy for the salt. There's a ton of salt, right? In the water. Unless you guys are going to argue it, the default is to bury Ja at sea, with all appropriate honors, but as captain of her crew, Sana doesn't want to risk the living for the dead. Blue doesn't care much about what we do with it. Once they're dead, it's just a corpse, not a person. I'm a goblin. I don't think I have any issue with cannibalism, really. Hear me out. We could eat her, okay? Then, the next day, when we are close enough to send out a shore party, we land and poop. Then, she becomes one with the soil again. I don't think anybody on the crew, even the eccentric chef, is considering eating humanoids. Especially their friend. Well, it wouldn't be my first choice. So it sounds like Anvil is outvoted, basically. Jinx puts her arm around Brother Anvil, tries to console him. People here have a lot of different faiths. I worship Larethal and the Forge Master, but as chaplain, I've got to try and look out for everyone. You're doing your best, but the captain has to balance the good of everyone. You're sensing that, like, the thought was appreciated, but if you overdo it, it's gonna get weird. If I were evil, I'd shapeshift into Ja, just walk across the deck. Ooh, how dare you throw me in the water? The day ends with Brother Anvil holding a sunset funeral for the 3 fallen sailors. He delivers the rites, and the captain says a few words about each one. I'll add a few words, too, about how we didn't know them, but they helped us survive, and we'll never forget their sacrifice. We'll never forget crossbow-loading guy. What's her name? The red shirt. Well, her shirt was red afterwards. Does Pelor have a magical sex sense? It's not magic, it's experience. Sex-perience? Pelor is an extremely fit, symmetric-faced, charismatic fellow. So when he goes into a bar or other environment where single people may be looking for an evening's entertainment, a relatively high proportion of those people are likely to be at least open to spending a night with him. Most want to talk first, try to suss out whether he's a proper himbo or some kind of creep they should avoid. Look for red flags, like, I don't know, a giant bladed weapon. But essentially, by virtue of receiving so much of this particular type of attention, far more than the average person, Pelor has become more attuned to it. He got pretty darn good at sensing who is just looking and who actually wants to go straight upstairs with him. This is all pretty logical, right? Instinct born of experience. And I think it's totally fair that he can accurately gauge that particular social attitude most of the time. And therefore, as he puts it, when somebody is not interested, he normally just shrugs his shoulders and moves on, because there's always somebody else. The problem is, that works fine when he is looking for that exact thing. A willing partner for a fun activity, usually for one night only. But his particular set of skills, the part before the bedroom anyway, is not necessarily that helpful at all in guiding him if he and or the other person he focuses on may be interested in a different way. Like, a few nights into the voyage, there have been a lot of clues that Captain Sana is what most of us would consider quite receptive to getting to know him better. I made an effort to convey this visually in subtle and not so subtle ways, because I really didn't want him to come off like a stalker or like he was being pushy. I mean, Pelor comes on pretty strong. He's used to working fast. But though it doesn't quote-unquote work, Sana does not seem bothered at all by it, and even gave him an extra glance as he was walking down the stairs the first night, not that he saw that. Which suggests, given the power imbalance, if any, ought to be in her favor, it suggests that she is not put off by his awkward, extremely forward flirting. So he's confused by the combination of her apparent openness, while she is definitely not giving him that come back to my room energy that he's so attuned to. Not even when she flirtily put her hat on his head after the storm. She did that, but she was visibly exhausted from hours of steering the ship through high seas, and so even as she smiled at him and appreciated the attention he was giving her, sex was not at all on her mind. In fact, if she were less tired, more aware of herself in that moment, she may have chosen to be a little less flirty to avoid giving him the wrong impression. Like many, probably most, people, Sana doesn't just leap into relationships with strangers. Even if she thinks you're cute and enjoys your company, she needs to trust you and feel comfortable to even think about moving further. And Pelor is a little immature in that way. He hasn't dealt with people on that level because there's almost always somebody else who's just up for some fun. And he just goes with them. But as noted in the episode, there's something about Captain Sana, and, well, he's on this ship for a while. There isn't an infinite pool of willing people to sleep through, like in a big city. So, sure, after several cold, lonely nights, he gave in and went to find out why they called Rudolph Longlegs. But momentary needs aside, Sana certainly seems to have triggered some kind of feelings that he's not used to and will still have to sort out. My awesome Patreon patrons get Secrets videos about a week early so that I can answer some of their questions in this final video on YouTube, where I read the questions out in random, sometimes ridiculous voices. Like this. Rex asked,
The first night they spent on the boat, Adria was shown with her eyes a crimson color instead of a normal light purple. Anything going on with that? Or, if you can't answer that one, Sana has a frost giant accent, which is mostly found in Vistria. Is she Vistrian? And if so, how did she end up way down in Elfland?
No, I'm sure it's not important that Adria's eye color was different when nobody was looking. But yes, Sana is from Vistria, as her accent suggests. She grew up on the northern coast, where her father was a rugged dock worker, but little Sana was fascinated by the huge ships with their many sails and the idea somebody put in her head, not expecting the words to stick with her for 10 years, that all those sailors she watched climbing on and off the vessels, they all answered to the captain, a single person, usually a person with a cool hat. When she was old enough, she signed on as a sailor. She didn't exactly run away, but just reached the point where her parents couldn't dissuade or delay her any longer. But because the southern waters were Diluvian territory, off limits, Vistrian traders mostly just sailed up and down the same 1,200 miles of coast, with only a few trips beyond that each summer to Korstrad when the waters of North Pass thawed enough for safe passage. And for all Sana liked about being at sea, working with wind and ropes, she quickly came to hate the unrelenting chill. The sea spray was sometimes cold enough to freeze on contact, turning her coat into rigid plates of cloth. So she got herself on one of those rare trips to Korstrad, and then hitched her way through the farmlands of Korderand to the Sea of Korst. It took her a couple tries before she found an elven ship that would hire her on, rather than laughing at her 2 years of experience. But when that captain docked in Glensantanslus, she heard another sailor complaining about the cold wind, which felt like friggin' summer to her, and she knew she'd found her place. Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin asked, kind of wondering about the different views of sexuality on display. I remember Vistria back in TDDC being very traditional, from conversations with Draven's son, whereas here we've seen some pretty open homoromantic displays. Is that just dwarf culture, sailor culture, or elves in general? I don't remember exactly what I said about that in the TDDC episodes, but if we're talking about Vistria and Draven's family, that's more an issue of nobility, where progeny, heirs, and inheritance are viewed as so important. Where, if Tobin claimed to be gay, whether or not it was true, his grandparents might have pushed to arrange marriage for him even sooner, before any non-baby-making tendencies could come out, so to speak, and complicate things. I think people around the world of death then mostly do what feels right for them in terms of sexuality, though heterosexuality is still the most common just because evolution favors that which makes babies. There tends to be some hint of the longer you live, the more likely you are to try things you otherwise might not have when dealing with mortals multiple centuries old, or with immortals like the Vampire Kings. I don't think living longer actually makes you homosexual or bi, but anybody not totally sure of their sexuality is just more likely to find out about themselves, one way or another, if they live and meet new people for an extra 100 years. Rinsaku Blade asked,
The discussion of funerals is quite interesting. From the discussion, there are different burial rites for each god. Can you tell us of any interesting or unique ones in the world?
Funereal traditions track religious sects more closely than the gods themselves, so you can't have a certain amount of variety even among followers of the same deity. Dwarves, being Tolkien ripoffs in many ways, used to build heavy stone coffins for all their dead, not just the rich and the nobles. But that tradition came from the ancient dwarf holds, with seemingly endless old mine shafts as tombs, and more stone than you could ever quarry in all directions. But traditions have changed since moving to the open space of Tark, surrounded by dirt, where stone is now a resource that must be accounted. So the rich, the Dons, still build stone tombs and coffins, and though not large in size, they have grown more decorated, more ostentatious than the often austere carven vaults of their ancestors. For the majority of dwarves, though, the traditions have evolved. The early colonists had few resources and divided nearly all of their time between survival and trying to build a new future. For those who died, they would dig as deep a hole as they had time for, and rather than a full coffin, they placed the body at the bottom, then covered it in a flat stone slab, carved with their deeds and the names of their ancestors, an echo of the top slab of the old tombs. When members of their family died, Their bodies would each, in turn, be placed upon the previous slab, with a new slab on top, piling up the bodies, the names, and the deeds. Over time, the slabs would settle, making room for more burials. Followers of Muradin believed the old bodies were absorbed into the stone above. These early graves were not so deep, though, and soon, at least soon in dwarven terms, families ran out of space and needed to dig new graves. But now, with the new nation more established, they dug the pits much deeper, supporting the sides with wood so they wouldn't cave in, allowing more layers of body and stone. That is the dwarven way. Ytarrans, following the same god by another name, they too built elaborate tombs, though the style was different. There, the poor used Etronium walls, while the clever, the important, the accomplished were buried in stone, or, rarely, in real mined metals, because the blue metal produced by a creation matrix was seen as lower value. Basic and practical. Ytarran tombs grew larger, more complex, and filled with treasure toward the end of their empire, as the numbers of creators dwindled, lonely among their created servants, both in life and death. Human followers of Infernus, their version of Itaru or Morden, tend to honor their dead with no coffin, but with a suit of metal burial armor, though such armor for commoners was thin, merely decorative, rather than expensive combat armor. In some areas, they are burned rather than buried, as though being reforged, their pyre armor blackened from reuse. Worshippers of Dialia, of nature, have many varied traditions. Some dig a shallow grave with a sapling on top for renewal. Others strip the body, laying it face down, facing the earth, with a wreath of local flowers and a root as a bracelet under a sheet of linen, leaving them to the predators. Devotees of Sirius perform a ceremony which prominently features the scales of justice. These symbolic scales always balance for the deceased, unless they're being executed for a crime, in which case the funeral is held while they still breathe, the executioner's swing coming only after the scales, again symbolically, fail to balance. For Diluvians, worshippers of Blibal, death's blood is the sacrament. On the battlefield, the remains of believers and infidels mix in a glorious monument of slaughter. And when a priest or emperor dies of old age, denied the glory of battle, they are consumed by their successor, carrying their essence forth, in the hopes that together they shall one day meet the violent death they have earned. The greatest honor for a follower of Delvash is a massive funeral procession laying them to rest in as grandiose a structure as possible, proving that their power and the devotion of their minions extends beyond death itself. Legends tell of an ancient queen in the Shadowfel whose armies continued to conquer, expanding her realm beyond her death, still bearing her palanquin in their midst, perfumed corpse and all, decades after her demise. She was not undead, her soul long departed, yet her generals still bowed to her, and none dared lay claim to her throne. Administrator Orange asked,
I've had a question in mind regarding monitors specifically. We've seen and heard about really sneaky monitors, kung fu wizard monitors, kickboxing monitors, and psionic monitors. So my question is, are there any monitors that use druidic magic? And if there are no druid monitors, what could that look like?
There are 5 monasteries, or depending how you're counting, up to 7, with vaults of hundreds of Deathfin scrolls and so many centuries worth of weirdo monitors inventing and reinventing techniques, mixing magic and martial arts. I haven't built druidic monitors, but you could have staff masters using shillelagh, wild shape warriors. You want to fight a bear who knows kung fu? Warshapers who have mastered partial wild shaping using all that toolkit and the right to bear arms, or a monitor who covers their body in spike growth. No shortage of possibilities, as with many other things. Mr. Nobody asked,
What was your inspiration for the Ytarrans and the Adar?
I can't think of any discrete inspiration I could name. It all sort of weaved and formed together. I wanted to mess around with the Warforged, make them old instead of new, so who built them? An ancient Magitech people. And then I started crafting a history, a style for them, the connection between Muradin, Itaru, and the peoples beloved by that god. But one ancient race on its own is boring. Who do they interact with, and how? There were elves and KT and dragons back then, but I liked the idea of a counterpart, other ancients who were similarly powerful, but different. Psionics instead of Magitech. And we get the Adar. But psionics are more internal, the body and mind, so they left much less behind, didn't leave the same kind of marks upon the land, just a bunch of weird crystals in one lonely city. And why are these powerful civilizations not around? They both disappeared in very different ways at different times, and I thought about those. So that's not inspiration so much as a streamlined version of the creation process. Of course, it was much less linear. Also, like a dumbass, I originally called them Ytarrans and Adarans, just like Diluvian and Illuvian is way too damn similar sounding, which is why I eventually changed half of those names. Grim Reaper asked, I was curious, since the Feywild and the Shadowfel in your world originated from Ioun and Vecna's eternal fight, would that affect spellcasting in those planes? Boosting arcane and nature magic in the Fey? Necromancy and shadow magic in the Shadowfel? Or other game effects? From a flavor and world-building point of view, the planes are very strongly influenced by those types of magic. Feywild feeling very free-flowing, maybe a little unpredictable, full of extremely varied creatures infused with that magic. Shadowfel being full of magic and creatures which are dark, hidden, or parasitic. But unlike a setting with dozens or infinite planes, I didn't want any of my 3 adventuring planes to inherently mess with the way D&D characters work. So the only generalized game mechanics you can really point to are that on the surface of the Shadowfel, corpses as a material component for spells are assumed to be freely available virtually anywhere. You can animate dead straight out of the dirt, unless you want a specific corpse. And in the Feywild, the mechanical changes are just how flight magic works, or doesn't, on the different Fey Sky strata, requiring different spells the higher up you go, as I described in that big Fey Sky livestream, with higher strata flight spells usually having significantly higher speeds, though of course each strata is a massively larger volume than the last, the farther you get from the planet, so actual stuff tends to be correspondingly more spread out, farther apart. Martin asked,
I'm a little curious about Pyros and Firehawks. A mix of bird and fire, yes, but what are they doing in the wild, in the Feywild? Nomadic flyers? Do they have territory they strongly protect? And do they need to eat?
Firehawks, known for their aggressive tendencies, fly in flocks numbering around 20 to 50, spending most of their days flying near the boundary between the earth sky, the lowest stratum, and the inner sky, the next layer up, though they fly down to rest in a shallow cave or other sheltered hideout during the night when their flames would be visible to predators at great distances. Though they will attack nearly anything if provoked, their preferred prey are certain huge creatures from the inner sky layer above them, particularly ones who drop down in order to reproduce on the ground. Their epizephyric maneuverability is hampered by the low altitudes. Fireflocks have also been seen to hunt gargantuan rocks, though it appears they only do so if the rock is injured or otherwise weakened first, since a healthy rock is simply too dangerous. It's unclear how long Firehawks can live. It's at least a half dozen years, but the maximum may be much longer. They don't appear to eat for most of this time, but staying as high as possible helps them to absorb the Fey energy from the air to help sustain them between sparse kills. They may go years between opportunities to attack, and sometimes withdraw early in the battle if their massive prey fights back too effectively, pulling back before suffering too many casualties. But when the flock does take down a great sky creature, they land around the carcass and burrow deep into it, where they lay their eggs. Larger creatures, from higher in both altitude and the food chain, tend to accumulate great reserves of Fey magic over their long lifespans, and this provides a rich energy source to be absorbed by the Firehawks' surprisingly dull-looking eggs. Once the flock establishes such a nest, the hawks stay low, circling around it for many weeks, defending the eggs until they hatch, after which many of the older generation tend to die off within days, while the new flock grow rapidly to take their place in the sky. Ytarrans have observed that when two separate flocks of Firehawks meet in the sky, they sometimes fly into a spiraling formation, resembling a loose fire tornado, from which they perform jousting behaviors for a few hours before separating back into their respective groups and flying off. The druid Demonac wrote that the fire flocks exchange several members when they leave this conflagration, and that the probing was a negotiation of sorts, trying to find members of equal health or strength so that the interchange was fair.
Levi Warren asked,
Will Hammer and Smoke ever start up again?
podcast? Yes. I'm excited to do more, and just last month I re-listened to the audio of the next couple sessions. The main obstacle is just the eternal pull of main series comes first, and 20 other things I want to make. The campaign on which the podcast is based, I don't know. I'm not the GM for that one, and it'd be really hypocritical for me to push him to restart, given I have 2 major D&D campaigns plus a Lancer game on hiatus. But the podcast has material up to around episode 10, where the arc ends in, I think, a strong way, yet also on a brutal cliffhanger. Anyway, like, subscribe, and all that stuff, and I really appreciate if you can share SOS with anybody who you think would enjoy it. Sea of Secrets Episode 5 is coming along, funded, as always, by my patrons at patreon.com/Demonac. The current economic climate is pretty depressing for a lot of people, despite what the stock market numbers may say. So I understand why fewer people can afford to pledge their hard-earned money to support occasional animated videos. And you shouldn't if you are having a hard time. Always take care of yourself and your loved ones first. But I do need new patrons to join up over time to replace those people who inevitably lose their jobs or get sick or just aren't as excited about my stuff anymore. So if you can afford to send a couple bucks a month my way, you would know that you helped to continue Sea of Secrets, that you helped to make this thing exist, if only in a small way. The rewards aren't that big or fancy, because when I make content, I'd really rather more people see it rather than fewer, but there are a few podcast episodes and downloads of most of the music of TDDC and SOS, and you'll be supporting my shows for all those people around the world who can't afford to chip in. So thanks again to all my patrons, past, present, and future, with a special shout out to Ethir Mordu, Administrator Orange, Andrew Drake, Albirio, Aust, Aurelius, Bedimir, Bessie, Captain Rook, Brethren, Carnlin, Critical Hit 20, Darkwood, Dimin, Dragonloot, Draugr, Earl of Sanguine, Ecardir Thalion, Fey Crossroads, Fireborn, Gator Island, Fright Knight, Gorefiend, General M.O., X, what? Oh, 9. Hakun, Lieutenant Red, Lonito, Lorebon, Malisondesh, Matt the Mage, Mars Project, MJ Threde, Norgren, OI1, Olden Man, Overlord Thor, Pedrig of Rooney, Pontus, Quackers, Ramar Ulfist, Tambu Ejun, Rex, Rewoot, Skyter97, Stan the Man, Starfall, Sygax, Toshiro 7, Volkfang, Valdis, W.A. Soul, Warsaw, Woodley, A. Zombie, the lovely members of the organization.